The fundamental question of justice often begins not in the quiet halls of a court, but on the fast-moving tracks of real life. Imagine driving a massive trolley car down a track at 60 miles an hour, only to realize your brakes are completely broken. Ahead of you stand five workers who have no idea you're coming, and you know with absolute certainty that continuing straight means ending their lives. Suddenly, you notice a side track to the right where only a single worker is standing. Your steering mechanism works perfectly, presenting a choice between striking the five or actively steering toward the one. Most individuals instinctively feel that turning the wheel is the correct path forward because minimizing the loss of human life feels like a logical necessity. This immediate moral reaction introduces a way of thinking that judges the rightness of an action based entirely on what happens afterward. The tragedy is unavoidable, but minimizing the body count feels like the only constructive goal left to pursue. This perspective suggests that our primary moral duty is to bring about the best possible outcome when every available option carries a heavy cost. This logical approach is what thinkers classify as consequentialist moral reasoning, a framework where the ultimate morality of an act is found in the state of the world it creates. In a desperate situation, numbers become the primary factor for making a decision, turning survival into a basic mathematical problem. People often look back at major historical tragedies, like the passengers who fought back on September 11 to bring down a hijacked plane in a field, as acts of heroic sacrifice driven by this exact mindset. The core idea is that when a catastrophe is already unfolding, it is better to lose fewer lives so that a greater number might survive. This way of thinking has an immediate practical appeal because it focuses on reducing total suffering when perfection is no longer an option. It treats human lives as components of a larger collective balance sheet, where the goal is always to keep the final loss as small as possible. This approach assumes that the right path is the one that leaves the world with the maximum amount of life and well-being remaining. However, relying entirely on outcomes to justify actions can lead to terrifying conclusions if pushed to its absolute limits. Critics of this approach point out that the exact same logic of sacrificing a minority for the sake of a majority has historically been used to defend horrific regimes, totalitarian control, and systemic atrocities. If the individual can always be traded away to benefit the group, then personal safety and human rights become entirely unstable concepts. Those who refuse to turn the trolley car often do so out of a deep fear of crossing a dangerous moral line where murder becomes acceptable through calculation. They argue that actively choosing to target an innocent person makes the driver a direct participant in a killing, rather than a victim of a terrible mechanical failure. For this minority, staying the course on the main track is a tragic submission to fate, whereas turning onto the side track feels like an active, unjustifiable assault on a bystander. They believe some actions are so fundamentally wrong that no amount of positive consequences can ever make them acceptable. To see if people truly believe that numbers should always dictate survival, we have to look at a slightly altered version of the same dilemma. Imagine you are no longer the driver of the broken trolley, but an onlooker standing on a footbridge overlooking the tracks where five workers are about to be struck. Next to you stands an extraordinarily large man, and you realize that a firm push would drop him directly onto the tracks below. His mass would successfully stop the speeding vehicle, saving the five workers, though the fall and impact would certainly kill him. Interestingly, the vast majority of people who eagerly voted to turn the steering wheel in the first scenario completely reject the idea of pushing the man off the bridge. The mathematical outcome remains completely identical. One person dies so that five other people can live, yet our moral comfort level shifts entirely. This dramatic shift reveals that our sense of right and wrong is not guided purely by a simple calculation of total survivors. This dramatic shift in human intuition forces us to look closely at what actually changed between the two scenarios to alter our judgment so completely. Many argue that pushing the man over the railing requires a direct, aggressive act of physical violence against someone completely outside the path of danger. In the first case, the worker on the side track was already on the rails, making him a part of the tragic situation by circumstance. The large man on the bridge, however, was completely safe until an onlooker decided to use his body as a piece of mechanical equipment. This explanation suggests that we feel a profound difference between redirecting an existing threat and dragging a peaceful bystander into a deadly conflict. We feel an instinctive barrier against using another human being as a mere tool for the survival of others, even when the goal is noble. This distinction highlights a deep-seated belief that individuals possess a boundary that should never be crossed by others. But does this distinction really hold up under closer examination, or is it just an emotional reaction to physical contact? To test this, we can alter the bridge scenario by removing the need for a physical push. Suppose the large man is standing on a mechanical trapdoor, and you can drop him onto the track simply by turning a small control wheel from a distance. If you turn that wheel, the physical effort feels exactly like steering the trolley, yet most people still feel that dropping him through the floor is deeply wrong. This reaction shows that the true issue is not the physical act of pushing, but the conscious choice to target someone who was completely safe. It reveals that we care deeply about intentionality and the specific role a person plays in a situation. We struggle with the idea of actively manufacturing a death, even if that death prevents a much larger natural disaster from occurring. This conflict reveals a second major way of looking at morality, known as categorical moral reasoning, which locates rightness in absolute duties and rights. From this viewpoint, certain actions are fundamentally wrong, regardless of how much good they might produce or how many lives they might save. It establishes absolute boundaries that protect individuals from being sacrificed for the greater benefit of the community or the majority. Categorical thinking argues that human beings possess intrinsic value that cannot be overridden by a simple cost-benefit analysis. This explains why we recoil at the bridge scenario. We recognize that pushing the man violates his fundamental right to life, an offense that cannot be justified by counting survivors. It suggests that justice is not just about calculating outcomes, but about respecting certain permanent, unshakable rules of human conduct. This perspective insists that our methods must be inherently good, not just our final results. To see how these competing ideas play out in other professions, we can look at a crisis inside a busy hospital emergency room. Imagine a doctor who receives 6 patients from a major transit accident. 5 have moderate injuries while 1 is in critical condition. If the doctor spends the entire day saving the 1 critical patient, the other 5 will certainly die from neglect. Conversely, if the doctor treats the 5 moderately injured people, they will all fully recover, but the single critical patient will perish. In this scenario, almost everyone agrees that the doctor should treat the 5 patients and allow the 1 to die. This choice mirrors the original trolley case perfectly, as it relies on maximizing the number of lives saved within an unfolding crisis. The doctor is simply managing a tragedy that has arrived at the hospital door, trying to do the most good with limited time. But if we look at a different medical scenario, our moral consensus completely shatters once again, revealing the fragility of our logic. Imagine a transplant surgeon who has 5 patients desperately dying of organ failure, each needing a different vital part to survive. A completely healthy person walks into the hospital for a routine checkup and falls asleep in the waiting room. The surgeon realizes they could quietly take this healthy person's organs, ending their life but saving the 5 dying patients. Virtually everyone views this action as an unthinkable crime, even though the final numbers are exactly the same as the emergency room case. This extreme reaction shows that we expect doctors to be caretakers of individual life, not mathematical calculators of human survival. It proves that we hold certain lines to be completely sacred, even when breaking them would result in a higher number of living people. These scenarios illustrate how our daily lives are constantly caught between the competing pressures of consequentialist and categorical thinking. The historical roots of the consequentialist approach find their most famous expression in utilitarianism, a system popularized by the philosopher Jeremy Bentham. Bentham argued that the highest principle of morality and law is to maximize utility, which he defined as the total balance of pleasure over pain. His view is built on the reality that all human beings are naturally guided by the pursuit of happiness and the avoidance of suffering. Therefore, he argued that individual actions and government policies should always aim to produce the greatest good for the greatest number of people. This philosophy offers a remarkably clear and practical guide for making difficult decisions across society. It sweeps away complex mysticism and focuses on the measurable impact our actions have on human happiness. Part 2. While Jeremy Bentham's philosophy provides an incredibly practical approach to societal organization, it immediately forces us to confront difficult questions about the value of the individual. If the ultimate goal of society is simply to maximize the collective happiness of the majority, then the rights of any single person can quickly become vulnerable. A consistent application of this theory requires us to accept that an innocent person can be sacrificed whenever the measurable benefits to the group outweigh the harm done to that individual. This perspective views society not as a collection of independent beings with sacred rights, but as a single collective organism whose total well-being must be optimized. For a dedicated planner, individual suffering is merely a negative variable that can be balanced out by increasing the happiness of others elsewhere. This focus on total outcomes explains why the theory can feel incredibly efficient in some moments and deeply terrifying in others. It challenges our traditional ideas of fairness by insisting that the group's welfare is the only metric that truly matters. To understand how these competing moral frameworks operate in the real world, we can look past hypothetical examples to an actual historical courtroom battle. In 19th century England, a famous legal case known as the Queen versus Dudley and Stevens tested the limits of survival and morality. A four-man crew on an English transport vessel was stranded in a small lifeboat 1,000 miles from land after a massive storm destroyed their ship. They were left with no fresh water and only 2 tins of turnips, quickly finding themselves facing slow starvation in the open ocean. The crew consisted of 2 experienced sailors, a ship's cook, and a 17-year-old cabin boy named Richard Parker. Parker was an orphan who had gone to sea against the advice of his friends, hoping the journey would turn him into a man. As the days turned into weeks without rescue, the physical condition of the men deteriorated rapidly, pushing them to the absolute edge of human endurance. For the first 3 days, the stranded crew carefully rationed their tiny supply of turnips to keep themselves alive. On the fourth day, they managed to catch a small turtle from the water, which sustained them for several more days of desperate waiting. After that food ran out, they spent 8 agonizing days with absolutely nothing to eat, while surrounded by dehydrating saltwater. The young cabin boy, ignoring advice, drank seawater directly from the ocean and quickly became violently ill, lying helpless in the corner of the small boat. By the 19th day of their ordeal, the captain suggested drawing lots to decide who should be killed so that the others might live on his body. The cook resisted the idea, and the crew ultimately failed to agree on a system for drawing lots that day. The situation highlights the complete breakdown of normal civilization when human beings are stripped of food, water, and hope. The next day, seeing no ships on the horizon, the captain decided that the young cabin boy should be sacrificed for the group. They reasoned that Parker was already dying from sickness, had no family depending on him, and would likely perish well before the rest of the crew. After offering a brief prayer for the boy's soul, they took his life, and for the next 4 days, the 3 remaining crew members fed on his body to stay alive. On the 24th day of their journey, a passing vessel finally spotted the lifeboat and rescued the survivors. Upon returning to England, the men were arrested, placed on trial for murder, and forced to defend their actions before a shocked public. The facts of the case were completely undisputed. One person had been intentionally killed to ensure that 3 others could survive. This real-life horror story forced the legal system and the public to decide whether extreme necessity can ever justify ending an innocent life. In the courtroom, the defense argued entirely from a perspective of survival and practical utility, looking at the net balance of human life. They pointed out that if the captain had not killed the boy, all 4 men would have certainly died of starvation before the rescue ship arrived. By sacrificing one person who was already weak, 3 men were successfully returned to their families, wives, and children. The defense framed the act not as a crime of malice, but as a tragic calculation made to prevent an even greater loss of life. From an outcome-focused perspective, saving 3 lives at the cost of one is an obvious benefit to the world's total pool of living people. They argued that normal moral rules cannot apply when nature strips away every option except the choice between total death and partial survival. This defense forces us to ask whether an action becomes right simply because it produces a better collective outcome under desperate circumstances. If we accept this logic, we are admitting that the morality of killing changes depending on the surrounding environment and the number of beneficiaries. It suggests that our rights are not permanent features of our humanity, but values that can fluctuate based on supply and demand. Opponents of this view argue that killing an innocent person is a permanent wrong that can never be excused by claiming it helped others live. They believe that by murdering the helpless boy, the crew committed an absolute evil that corrupted the very meaning of justice. This debate shows that real-world legal battles are often arguments over whether outcomes or permanent rules should guide human civilization. To test the consistency of this outcome-focused view, we have to ask if our opinion changes if the cabin boy had given his explicit consent. If the boy had volunteered to sacrifice himself for the crew, many people would feel that the captain's actions were much more acceptable. This shift shows that we care deeply about personal choice and the voluntary surrender of rights. However, a strict calculator of utility would argue that consent does not actually change the physical balance of pleasure and pain in the world. To a pure utilitarian, the loss of a life is the same regardless of whether the victim agreed to it beforehand. The focus on consent reveals a lingering belief in personal ownership that sits uncomfortably alongside a pure calculation of outcomes. It suggests that we want to balance efficiency with a respect for individual willpower. Another crucial factor to consider is the method used to choose the victim, such as a fair process like drawing lots. If the crew had agreed to a random lottery and the boy had lost fairly, the public outcry would likely have been much milder. A fair process gives every individual an equal stake and an equal risk, which satisfies our basic demand for structural fairness. This realization shows that human beings care deeply about procedures, not just the final body count at the end of a tragedy. We are often willing to accept a terrible outcome if we believe the path taken to get there was open and impartial. This introduces the idea that justice is tied to the rules of engagement, rather than just the final distribution of costs and benefits. This real-world case demonstrates that applying a philosophy focused entirely on outcomes is far more complicated than simply performing basic math. It forces us to confront what we lose when we treat human beings as interchangeable numbers in an equation for collective happiness. If a society becomes too comfortable sacrificing individuals for the common good, it risks destroying the trust that holds communities together. The terror of a world without absolute rights is that anyone could find themselves in the position of the cabin boy if the numbers turn against them. This tension ensures that our debates over public policy will always be torn between doing what is efficient and doing what preserves human dignity. We are constantly searching for a way to maximize our collective well-being without losing our moral boundaries in the process. The persistent debate over these historical and hypothetical cases shows that moral philosophy is not a collection of dead ideas but an active force. We live out our answers to these profound questions through the laws we support, the politicians we elect, and the daily choices we make. When we debate healthcare access, tax policy, or national security, we are constantly arguing over whether to prioritize collective utility or individual rights. The challenge of studying justice is that it takes our familiar, everyday assumptions and makes them feel suddenly unfamiliar and complex. Once you begin to look at the world through these competing frameworks, it becomes impossible to see simple situations in the same way again. The journey of analyzing justice does not give us easy answers. Instead, it creates a productive restlessness in our minds that forces us to think more deeply. Part 3. The true challenge of exploring these ideas is that they force us to confront our own internal inconsistencies and hidden assumptions. We often discover that the principles we proudly claim to follow in one situation are completely abandoned when the context changes slightly. This realization can be incredibly unsettling because it disrupts our comfortable belief that we possess a unified, perfectly logical moral code. It reveals that our sense of right and wrong is often an unexamined mix of emotional reactions, cultural habits, and competing philosophies. When we are forced to defend our views under pressure, we quickly see how difficult it is to build a flawless system of justice. This internal tension is exactly what makes the study of ethics so essential for anyone looking to understand human behavior. It forces us to do the hard work of matching our specific choices with the broader values we claim to support. This search for alignment is the driving force behind the evolution of modern law, public policy, and political debate across the globe. When a government designs a tax system, drafts an environmental regulation, or shapes a criminal law, it is actively choosing between competing moral priorities. If a state builds a highway through a neighborhood to reduce traffic for thousands of commuters, it is prioritizing collective utility over individual property. Conversely, when a court protects the free speech of an unpopular minority, it is upholding a categorical right over the comfort of the majority. These everyday political battles are the real-world versions of the trolley problem playing out across our cities and institutions. They show that philosophy is not an academic luxury, but the foundational blueprint for how we organize our shared lives. Every law on the books is a concrete statement about what a society values most when interests inevitably collide. To understand the full impact of these ideas, we have to look closely at how Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism attempted to transform the legal landscape. Before his work, laws were often based on ancient traditions, religious doctrines, or the arbitrary whims of ruling monarchs. Bentham sought to sweep away this confusing system by introducing a single, scientifically measurable standard for justice: the maximization of pleasure and the minimization of pain. He believed that everything from prison design to economic policy should be subjected to this clear, rational test. This approach was incredibly radical because it insisted that every person's happiness should count equally, regardless of their social class or family background. It offered a democratic promise that laws should serve the actual, measurable well-being of ordinary citizens rather than the privileges of an elite few. Yet this emphasis on equality through calculation introduces a major technical problem. How do we actually measure and compare human feelings? A strict application of this theory requires us to treat all pleasures and pains as if they can be placed on a single scale. It assumes that the joy of reading a great book, the comfort of a warm meal, and the agony of an injury can all be converted into numbers. Critics argue that this attempt to quantify human experience completely flattens the rich complexity of our lives. They insist that some values like love, honor, and human dignity are qualitatively different and cannot be traded like currencies in a marketplace. If we try to reduce every moral question to a simple calculation, we risk losing our ability to appreciate things that are deeply meaningful but impossible to measure. This attempt to put a uniform value on everything becomes especially controversial when public policies put a literal price tag on human life. Insurance companies, transportation departments, and environmental agencies regularly calculate the monetary value of a statistical life to decide which safety regulations are worth funding. For example, a government might decide against mandating a costly brake upgrade for trains if the total price of installation exceeds the economic value of the lives saved. While these calculations feel cold and deeply mechanical, defenders argue they are an unavoidable reality of managing a world with limited resources. A state cannot spend its entire budget on a single safety project. It must make difficult choices about where resources will do the most good. This reality shows how easily an outcome-focused philosophy can slide into a purely financial analysis of human survival. To fix these obvious flaws, later philosophers like John Stuart Mill tried to update the theory by introducing the concept of higher and lower pleasures. Mill argued that human beings are capable of intellectual and artistic experiences that are fundamentally superior to basic physical pleasures. He famously wrote that it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, suggesting that true utility must account for our development as refined individuals. This adjustment was an attempt to save the philosophy from being viewed as a crude system fit only for animals. By recognizing qualitative differences in human experiences, Mill hoped to build a framework that could protect intellectual freedom and personal growth. However, this change complicates the theory significantly, as it requires us to decide who gets to judge which pleasures are superior. Mill also attempted to defend individual liberty by arguing that respecting personal rights is ultimately the best way to ensure long-term societal happiness. He suggested that if a society routinely oppresses its citizens or silences critics, it will eventually stagnate, lose its creativity, and suffer a decline in overall well-being. Therefore, protecting individual freedom is not an alternative to utility, but the most reliable method for achieving it over time. This clever argument tries to bridge the gap between categorical rights and the calculation of final outcomes. It allows us to protect individual freedom while still claiming that our ultimate goal is the general welfare of the community. Yet, this approach leaves rights vulnerable to the possibility that if oppression ever did produce a better outcome, it could technically be justified. This vulnerability is precisely why categorical thinkers like Immanuel Kant rejected the idea of building morality on a foundation of changing consequences. Kant argued that if our duties are based entirely on what produces happiness, then our moral rules will always be unstable and dependent on circumstances. He insisted that true morality must be built on reason alone, producing absolute laws that apply to everyone everywhere without exception. This perspective demands that we treat every human being as an end in themselves, never as a mere tool or a stepping stone for someone else's benefit. This philosophy provides a sturdy shield for the individual, ensuring that our fundamental rights can never be negotiated away for the convenience of the majority. It insists that justice is about doing our duty out of pure respect for the moral law, regardless of the emotional or practical results. The ongoing debate between these two powerful schools of thought is what keeps the study of political philosophy so vital and challenging today. It prevents us from settling into easy dogmatism or lazy skepticism, forcing us to constantly question the fairness of our social structures. When we participate in public debates, we are helping write the ongoing story of what our society believes justice truly means. This process can be deeply uncomfortable because it challenges our certainties and exposes the messy contradictions in our daily thinking. However, this discomfort is a necessary part of intellectual growth, lifting us out of unexamined habits and opening up new ways of seeing the world around us. The value of this effort is not that it delivers a single universally accepted answer, but that it trains us to think more carefully about the choices that define our collective future. Ultimately, the study of justice reminds us that our choices have profound consequences for the quality of our shared civilization. Whether we choose to look at the world through the lens of collective utility or absolute rights, we are responsible for the outcomes of those choices. We cannot simply throw up our hands and claim that morality is entirely a matter of personal opinion, because we live out our answers to these questions every single day. The institutions we build, the laws we enforce, and the safety nets we provide are all living proof of our core values. By engaging in the difficult work of philosophical debate, we are actively participating in the creation of a more thoughtful world. The true goal of this journey is to awaken a persistent desire for clarity, ensuring that we never stop striving to align our practices with our highest ideals.